It all boils down to, do you actually think that trans women and intersex women are real women and are really female or not? And if you do, it's very simple. Just stop policing who counts as a real woman.
Guys, my name is Emily and I'm a track athlete. I've represented Australia in the steeplechase at the Under 20 World Championships, and now I'm a student athlete in the US. For part of my coursework this semester, I've been studying the issue of transgender women competing in the female category in sports. This is a huge issue, and I've done a lot of digging into it and the science behind this. And today I'm going to react to an interview on The Daily Show, which features a trans athlete and activist named Veronica Ivy.
On the face of it, it seems simple, as you say. If somebody identifies as a woman, if they're transgender, they can compete against women who are born biologically, and then if not, then not. But then there are many who would argue who are not transphobes. There are many who are born biologically women who will say, but you have an unnatural advantage over me, and that makes the sport unfair. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, there's lots of ways you can respond to that. So the first is the very language of, you were born and I'm not biological somehow, like I don't think I'm a cyborg. So like this idea that like, oh, you're not a biological woman. Well, I am a woman. That's a fact.
We are going to accept that fact. That is a fact for the moment. Given that we as a culture can't even define what a woman is at the moment, it's a little hard to be certain, but I will give you that you're a woman.
I am female, so all my identity records, my racing license, my medical records all say female, right? And I'm pretty sure I'm made of biological stuff, so I'm a biological female as well. So this question of, do trans women have an advantage over cis women?
I need to stop that. Okay. There's a lot going on. The idea that you're a biological female because you identify as female and you're made of biological stuff. I think that most people can see that this kind of misses the point that being a female is a scientific term. Like, we, as a culture, we've tended to move away from the idea that gender is binary, that there's only two genders. But sex is pretty scientific. Like, we have some people who are intersex, but most people either have testes and are male and have like an XY chromosome, or they're a female and have XX and ovaries. And I know there's a tiny bit of gray area, but there's these biological things that determine whether you're male or female. And I think we really need to acknowledge that.
Women. We don't know. In fact, there's basically no published research on this question.
So there's debate, but the most recent research on whether transgender women have an advantage over cis females or people who are born as females, it seems to indicate that they do, which is what we'd expect, because these are people who've been through male puberty, and throughout puberty, the body produces testosterone, and testosterone results in things like increased height, increased hemoglobin, increased like arm width, increased like cardiovascular, like your lung size increases, your heart size increases. And even if you start taking testosterone suppressing therapy, like hormones, and you no longer have that testosterone, you still retain all of these different performance advantages that you've gotten through male puberty. And there's been one study that found that there wasn't much of a difference for some, like 8 runners, but a more recent study was done by Roberts et al. I'll put a link in the description, and that found that whilst transgender women, once they started hormones, they were able to do less push-ups and sit-ups, they were still able to run up to 20% faster than the baseline for women. So there's definitely an advantage, and we don't know how big it is. So it's a very small population, so it is hard to make generalized conclusions. But what research we have seems to indicate that transgender women do retain a performance advantage over cis women.
But I think it's irrelevant because we allow all kinds of competitive advantages within women's sport.
Okay, so what Veronica is going to talk about here is pretty much that there's a massive height difference in high jump. This is a really common argument, is that there's already a really big range within the female category. So what's going to be so bad about adding in trans women? But the thing is that sports bodies find it necessary to differentiate between biological sexes because there is such a big difference, often 10%, sometimes greater difference. And there are other things that we choose to categorize people based on. Age is a really good example. Like, you wouldn't think that it would be fair to have a 21-year-old competing in the under sevens age group. Like, there's differences. And so, yes, we will allow lots of differences between those 5-year-olds competing in the, or 6-year-olds competing in the under sevens. But we're not going to allow a 21-year-old to also compete against them. So I think this is a moot point.
If there's an advantage, and I'm not saying that there is, for trans women in women's sport, it's not an unfair advantage. But also, we've been trying to compete at the highest level for decades. We've been allowed to compete for decades. And no one has won an elite world championship. No one has won an Olympic gold medal. This Tokyo Olympics was the first time trans.
So unfortunately, the absence of evidence is not evidence in itself. Just because something hasn't happened yet doesn't mean that it won't happen. And before it happens, it's probably the best time to figure out what we're going to do about transgender women in sport before we suddenly have all of these world records that have been made and unbeatable records that we're going to have to try and deal with. So it's probably best off to deal with this issue now.
Women even qualified for the Olympics. So this idea that trans women are suddenly going to take over women's sport is an irrational fear of trans women, which is the dictionary definition of transphobia.
I think I've shown in this video that this fear isn't irrational. There is scientific evidence that's supporting this. It's not really fear, it's more of a concern. We're seeing something, it doesn't seem fair. We know that sport is a human right, and we do want transgender women to be able to compete in sport. It just doesn't seem like the female category is the right place for them to compete. So later in this interview, Veronica rules out some solutions, but I think they really deserve further looking into, things like creating another category like they do in the Paralympics. They have separate categories for different classes of disability, and then you compare your score to your disability, and it allows people to compete and even to have para athletes compete against people like me. They can race in the same race and then have their time compared to their own standard, which allows them to have just the same opportunities and still win state championships and everything. It's just competing against other people who are on a similar playing field. Bye!